In honor of the recently shuttered Post.News app, Mike, what is on your mind?
Well, I'm wondering what's going to happen with all these apps that are trying to come around. But the bigger thing is that I think there's just too much news, and figuring out what we're going to cover and how we're going to cover it is becoming a real chore. And I'm wondering if we're going to have to turn this into a 2-hour podcast, a 3-hour podcast. Maybe we need to be like broadcasting all the time, Ben.
Yeah, it's been a hell of a week, isn't it? Yeah.
It has been one hell of a week. What is on your mind, Ben?
I'm wondering if we can get our very learned audience involved in the choosing of our opening gambits. I think part of our issue is that we spend so much time researching old deceased social media apps and the calls to action that they used to use. So listeners, if you have any thoughts, you know where we are, podcast at Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. You do get in touch.
Yeah, I am wondering when the post prompt began, because I was looking at some of the old deceased social media apps and messaging apps, and the early ones didn't have any sort of prompt. It is a newish thing, but I'm not quite sure where it started.
There's a history lesson there, I'm sure. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. This week's episode is brought to you as ever with the financial support of the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund. My name is Ben Whitelaw. I'm the founder and editor of Everything Moderation, a weekly newsletter bringing you the best of the trust and safety stories from the last 7 days. And I'm joined by Mike Masnick, who is always on the go. Could be live streaming constantly from Tech Dirt if he wanted to. How's it going, Mike?
I'm good. I'm exhausted, busy as always, and there's just always things happening.
Yeah, that's the default, isn't it, nowadays? Just like exhausted, overcome with the news. If I had to respond to a post on post.news, I would just say exhausted, I think.
Yes.
But we're here and we're bringing our best selves to the podcast this week again.
Yes, absolutely.
We've got a lot to cover.
A shot of caffeine to be doing
Exactly.
the podcast.
Exactly. Whether you're listening to this on Friday evening or across the weekend or on Monday morning, we hope this brings you a little bit of a perk up and all your news for the week. Let's get started, Mike. Let's get right into the mix of things. There's a whole bunch of stories that we want to talk about this week. The story that we both agreed was one of our big two stories this week was a new report from Stanford that you have really gone into the weeds on. You were telling me before we came on and started recording that the research of this report said that, you might be one of the few people who've gone through it in detail. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I don't know about that, but yes, some of the authors of the report were happy. I wrote 2 separate posts about it. I have recorded, but will not be released by the time this podcast is released. I've recorded an interview with a couple of the authors of the report. It's from the Stanford Internet Observatory, which it does a ton of really great work on a bunch of stuff. But the report itself is looking at the cyber tip line from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which has become sort of the de facto global system for how we deal with what's known as child sexual abuse material, or CSAM, online, in that U.S. companies are required to report if they come across any CSAM to the cyber tip line. And then NCMEC and the cyber tip line are supposed to review the information that is reported. They are the only entity effectively in the world that has a legal right to store and obtain child sexual abuse material without facing, criminal consequences for it, for the purpose of investigation. And then they coordinate with local law enforcement around the world to try and deal with whatever sort of criminal violations have happened.
And before we jump into the report, Mike, when did NCMEC come about? Because there are people listening who probably don't know exactly like what this body is, where it comes about, and it's useful context before we jump into the actual research.
Yeah, so it's, I forget the exact timing on the year, but it was set up as a private nonprofit organization, but set up by the U.S. government effectively to coordinate around issues with missing and exploited children. And it's really taken on an increasingly larger and larger role as a bunch of the issues around, child sexual abuse material went online. So the rise of the internet really sort of, as the internet grew, NCMEC's role really changed and expanded somewhat with it, though its funding hasn't necessarily kept up with
Mm.
that, nor its technology, as the report detailed. But it is this organization, and it's structured in a way to, in theory, try to deal with, and this is some of what comes out in the report, try to
Mm.
deal with some of the legal challenges and the privacy issues around finding information, what is being shared, who is sharing it, and sharing that information with law enforcement in a way that lives up to, in the US, certainly Fourth Amendment scrutiny, but there's some confusion over where those lines are drawn. And then around the rest of the world as well, it comes up in questions around data privacy and data protection and how information is handled in various countries.
So because the major platforms are all based in the US, they are obliged to pass on CSAM, right, to the organization
Yes.
via the cyber tip line.
Yeah, and so it's it's a little tricky, but some of the Fourth Amendment issue that's involved here, and it's sort of important to understand this and to go a little bit deep into the weeds, is that the government cannot force companies to search for this stuff, because then they would effectively be government agents. And if the government is directing you to search for content, then you have Fourth Amendment concerns, and they cannot require a search without a warrant, and a warrant requires probable cause for criminal behavior. So
Mm.
there's a lot of people who keep demanding that there should be a law passed that requires Meta and Twitter and everybody to do searches for child sexual abuse material. And you totally understand the thinking behind that, because you
Hmm.
say, like, oh, this material is out there, it'd be better if it was found. But requiring them to find it would then effectively ruin that evidence for any criminal prosecution, because the response, if that information is found and it was done at government request without a warrant, without probable cause, the remedy for that is excluding the evidence. So requiring these companies to search for stuff would then make it harder to actually prosecute the actual criminals, which is very problematic. But the way we've sort of gotten around is that, one, we have this private nonprofit where you have to report this stuff. And then the issue is that if a company finds child sexual abuse material and they do not report it, they face very stiff penalties. And so the requirement is that they, as soon as they come across it in any form, they have to report it. And of course, that leads to the potential, and the report sort of details, of significant over-reporting. If you are
Yeah.
unsure, you report. The punishment for reporting something that shouldn't have been reporting is nothing. The punishment for missing something that you should have reported could be massive.
Right.
Massive fines.
So let's get into the weeds on the report then.
Yeah.
Before we do so, I just looked it up. 1984 it was founded.
Okay.
Co-founded apparently by Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
Interesting. So, but let's get into the report, because there's a lot of stuff in there. What were your key takeaways from what the authors put out?
So it is a super, super important addition to the knowledge on these things. Obviously, one of the biggest issues that faces everyone who does any sort of trust and safety work is dealing with child sexual abuse material. I've heard from people that if you have a platform that allows the uploading or sharing of any kind of visual or video content, you have a child sexual abuse material. There is no two ways around it. It is just, that is what happens. It is one of the first things that platforms realize, that they have to have some sort of trust and safety effort to deal with. But the whole sort of CSAM ecosystem and how it works has been incredibly opaque. And for a variety of reasons, people just have not been particularly aware of it. Some of what comes out in the report is even people who are on the reporting side don't fully understand what happens when they report. And people on the law enforcement side don't fully understand what the motivations of the companies are when they're reporting and what information they're providing. So just having that out there and having a way to actually understand the report, they spent many months on it. They interviewed dozens of people all across the board who were involved in the system. They spent a lot of time really trying to understand it. I know that people at Stanford did a few days that they spent at NCMEC, like shadowing the cyber tip line employees and seeing what they
Mm.
were doing every day. They really got deep and they really reveal a whole bunch of stuff. So just having it out there is like a major contribution.
Yeah,
This,
something new.
yeah. The second part that really stood out to me was everybody knew that the system is not doing as well as it should. I think everybody understood that. Obviously there is a large CSAM issue with the internet, and it always feels like more could be done. But understanding where the problems lie was always not entirely clear. And some of that has to do with just the opaqueness of the system itself. And what you learn from reading the report is that there are a whole bunch of potentially problematic incentives. I mentioned one already, like the over reporting, and so everybody gets overloaded. But all of the incentives sort of conflict with one another, and it creates a really challenging situation where there are things that could be made better, and the report has a bunch of recommendations, but there is no easy fix. A lot of these are sort of naturally occurring incentive structures that are not something you fix easily by like passing a new law or upgrading technology or something like that. Those can help and can significantly help. And when you're talking about protecting children, probably worth doing these things to
Mm,
help. Um,
definitely.
but there is no like silver bullet. This is going to fix everything kind of thing.
And so the kind of one of the key outcomes to that point is the fact that law enforcement officers who receive tip-offs from the cyber tip line, they don't actually know which of the kind of tip-offs are more serious, right? This is kind of
Yeah.
a key finding. And it's really interesting to me as somebody who has no idea of how the system works, like many of us, to see that, yeah, if two reports come across your desk and you don't have a clear sense of what offender is more likely to commit further CSAM related
Yes.
crimes in the immediate future, you can't make an informed decision about that. So talk more about that and some of the other kind of
Yeah.
insights.
And again, like you begin to get a sense of how challenging this is because there were a couple of different things there. One is that on the platform side, the platforms reporting this, there are like different checkboxes in the system, and often they don't fully understand which checkboxes are important for letting law enforcement know, like, this is really serious, this is happening. But
Mm,
also, even more interesting to me was there was a part of the report that detailed that some people in trust and safety roles within the companies felt that they didn't want to add in more information than the purely factual information. So they didn't want to say like something to the effect of like, I have a hunch that this person is very serious and like that something needs to be done about this person, or because they were afraid like if they got that wrong, the consequences of that could be massive.
mm,
Providing any information that is just like, but if people who work in trust and safety and who have done this work for a while and see this stuff, they will often have a good sense of like which ones are the more serious ones, which ones do they need to deal with. But
right.
there are like reasonable incentive structures in place that make it hard for them to get across which ones they think are more serious. And the system is designed where on NCMEC's side, they don't want to provide too much information to the companies because, again, then you run into the Fourth Amendment problem. Like, are they instructing the companies how to do this? So they don't want to do that. And then law enforcement is receiving these reports from NCMEC, but again, without all of that other information, like what the employees are actually thinking, which ones are serious, and there's no way for them to do it. So they're just sort of going by gut, and they have issues on their end on the law enforcement side where they have to prioritize a whole bunch of different things, some of which are related to dealing with CSAM and some of which are dealing with, somebody's house got burgled and they have to go deal with that. And one of the things that comes out in the report is that police feel that dealing with like local burglaries is often more important because the people whose houses have been burgled say that they need a police report in order to go to insurance. And so they're getting all this pressure to do that. Whereas dealing with CSAM, even though is a major, major important issue, and if police can rescue someone and stop an abuser, that is obviously super important. But they said that often police chiefs just don't prioritize this issue. Local prosecutors, in some cases, they found might not prioritize these issues, in part because being able to seat a jury that is going to be exposed to CSAM is a huge
Mm,
issue because it's
yeah.
very tough to find anyone who's willing to do that. Even some judges refuse to look at that and look at CSAM, even though to some extent to understand what they're judging. They have to, there's all sorts of issues where it's like a really, really difficult situation. And that this is like, again, there's so much more in the report. Like these are just a few
Yeah.
examples where you begin to look at this and you're like, oh gosh, at every step of the way, it's
Yeah.
really, really difficult to figure out a way to actually make this system work that doesn't cause other problems.
Yeah. And we're going to come on to a story later on about the prevention of CSAM.
Yeah.
And this report makes clear, and what you've spoken about there makes clear that really the onus should be on preventing CSAM being distributed, right? Because once it has been distributed, you set up this chain of events via NICMEC to law enforcement that, as you detailed, are really, really hard to resolve and to catch up on and to address because it runs into kind of murky waters of the legal system. So we'll come on to that. I was really interested in the platforms and the distribution of tips to the cyber tip line and how Facebook were and Instagram as part of Meta were responsible for 82%
Yes.
of all tips. Why is that, do you think? Is that because other platforms are as large in some respects? You know, you've got Google, you've got WhatsApp, but they're responsible for 4% of all platform
Well,
tips.
WhatsApp is part of Meta, right? So WhatsApp
Right.
does report CSAM, and they are included in the Meta batch, and they do report a lot. And just as an aside, like an important part is there have been all these issues around encryption and end-to-end encryption, and the fear that that is harmful for the fight against CSAM. Yet WhatsApp does have end-to-end encryption, and yet they report a very large number of CSAM issues
Mm-hmm.
as well. So again, I think like the fear about end-to-end encryption appears to be a little bit overblown. But I think there's a few different issues here. One is that Meta is much larger than any of those platforms. Like,
Yeah.
there are lots of large platforms, but Meta is bigger. And like the structure of Meta and the various apps, Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp, all in some ways are conducive to people trying to share and distribute CSAM. But part of it also is that for all of the crap that Meta takes, they also have put a tremendous effort into finding and reporting this stuff. So the large number of reports is partly giving credit to Meta for how seriously they actually do take this issue and reporting it. Now, I think the downside of this is that politicians and the media flip that around and they show all of those reports and they say that is proof that Meta is not doing enough. There is the flip side to that argument, which I think is stronger, which is like, no, like the reason you're seeing all those reports is because Meta does take it seriously. They have all these tools to find and report this material, and that's why they are the largest reporter, as compared to, and the report mentions this a little bit, an example like Telegram, where does no reports. Now, Telegram is not a US-based company, but there are lots of reasons to think that Telegram should be reporting CSAM to NICMEC and the cyber tip line as well, and they simply choose to do 0 reports. And so one of the things that the report mentions, which is that there are situations where discussions may start on one platform and they almost always push people to move to Telegram to go further with regards to CSAM content because users of the platform realize that Telegram does very little to nothing to police CSAM.
Yeah, interesting. And so it is worth noting that despite all the challenges related to the cyber tip line system, the report does note it is worth preserving, it's worth nurturing.
Yes.
And this is something that was mentioned by Alex Stamos and Evelyn Dueck on the Moderated Content podcast, but like this is a system that needs investment, right?
Yeah.
It needs investment in staff, it needs investment in technology in order to be able to scale the work that it does, right?
For all the challenges of the program, it does work in many ways, and it could work much better. And a lot of the limitations are around the technology side. There's a whole thing we don't need to get into where effectively by law, they're banned from using the cloud. So they have their own servers where they store the material that they have. And if they were able to have cloud-based systems, they could have some better technology. They could use AI classifiers that were designed by others that they could pop in. There are a bunch of other things that they could potentially use that would improve things. There are some other things around like being able to hire good technologists to help them to update their systems. They use XML, which is now effectively obsolete and very outdated. There are a whole bunch of things that they could improve which would help on the reporting side. And then hopefully things like in this report that are giving some visibility for trust and safety people to understand things, for law enforcement to understand things, hopefully could also lead to better situations. But if there was more funding for NCMEC, I think that could go a long way towards helping. Again, there's no silver bullet. There's always going to be issues here, but could be really, really helpful for, based on the report. It's pretty striking.
Yeah. Okay. A really helpful and important addition to our understanding of how CSAM can be avoided. We'll park that and we'll move on now to our next big story, which is across the waters over in the EU. And I noted this week, Mike, there's been a flurry of interesting DSA-related news, which I think feels like the kind of Commission cranking up their implementation of the DSA. I was in Perugia last week and met a number of people who are really closely involved with the Commission, and there's a massive focus, and a number of kind of EU officials have come out in the last few weeks saying that the focus now is on making sure that the raft of regulation that's come out is implemented properly. So we're really starting to see that play out, I think. I will mention the fact that there are 6 countries who have kind of had their wrists slapped by the Commission this week for not appointing digital service coordinators, which are the kind of heads of the respective countries and the point people for the regulation itself. And so there's been a bit of a line drawn by the EU Commission to make sure that these people are put in place as soon as possible, because without them, you can't really enforce the DSA. But the story I really wanted to bring to you was a TikTok one again. We're going to talk a bit about the TikTok story in the US. We can't not. But we've seen that this week that the Commission has opened a second investigation against TikTok about the launch of an app that I had no idea about, that we talked before the podcast that you had no idea about, called TikTok Lite, which is a kind of lightweight version of TikTok for countries, people with lower internet capacity. And it's super interesting to see that the DSA go after TikTok again, just a few months after it opened its first investigation on breaching rules around moderating content and transparent advertising. So we have a situation here where the European Commission are going after TikTok on 2 fronts, and it's basically not dissimilar to what's happening in the US, but it's the kind of wheels of regulation turning very slowly and putting pressure on these apps to moderate content in a way that is more transparent and more visible to us. So I found that really interesting. I think the outcome of this TikTok Lite story is to be seen. Basically, after the investigation was launched, the TikTok policy team announced that they had removed the aspect of the TikTok Lite app which had caused the Commission to go after it. There's a thing called the Task and Rewards Program, which incentivizes users to use the app more. And the Commission has said that this was potentially addictive and was causing users to be using the app more than necessary. So TikTok has pulled that away. We're in a position now where the app exists in a couple of countries in the EU, but these investigations will be ongoing and they'll be reported out over the next couple of weeks and months. How does this fit with what's happening in the US, right? Give me the view from across the Atlantic.
I mean, it's interesting, right? So this is the same week that the US passed the bill, which they don't want anyone to call a TikTok ban, but which everyone recognizes is effectively a TikTok ban if ByteDance doesn't divest from its ownership stake. I did think, just to comment a little bit on the DSA EU version of this, it was interesting, one, that TikTok, recognizing that it is under significant scrutiny everywhere in the world right now, for it to release this task and reward program, which I always have few issues with, like, politicians jumping in and saying, like, you're making your app addictive, because, like, to some extent, where is the line between making your app useful so people like it and making it addictive? And the issue with addiction is when it is harmful and problematic. And if you're making an app that is legitimately useful, how do you distinguish between those things? And I'm not fully confident that politicians are really the best at determining where that line should be drawn. But at the same time, it strikes me as, like, sort of tone deaf for TikTok to think now is the time to introduce
Right.
this sort of feature. People have complained, especially in like the video game context. You have similar things with like loot boxes
Yeah.
and these kinds of things that sort of try and get people to spend more time on games. There have been all of these complaints about it and concerns about it raised by governments around the world. And you would think that maybe TikTok would take a breath and say, like, maybe right now where we're facing this
Yeah.
much scrutiny, we shouldn't be launching this.
This is like a red flag to a European Commission bull,
Yes.
right? Like this
Yeah.
is provocative in the extreme.
Yeah.
In two major countries in the EU launching an app while you're under investigation
Yes.
that has potential violations of the EU's kind of biggest and newest
Yes.
online speech
Yeah.
legislation. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah. You know, at a time where it feels like, and you can tell me if you feel differently, but like the EU sort of wants someone that they can take down with the DSA
Yeah.
to prove that the DSA is working. And
Yeah.
so, like,
This
tread
is blood
carefully.
sport.
Yes.
Yeah, this is blood sport, and the EU smell blood, and
Yes.
that somebody's gonna end up on the wrong side of a bullhorn. To
Yeah.
continue my analogy, I think it's really interesting that they did it now. It's also interesting how quickly they responded.
Yes.
You know, there's not many. We've had, I think this is third or fourth investigation the commission has opened. I don't feel like the others that were opened on X/Twitter, on TikTok, or on AliExpress yielded a reaction like this.
Yeah.
Like within days, having them disable an app that was in question. So there's an admission there, I think, of some sorts that, okay, this was us pushing it, but it will be interesting to see how that plays out.
And, you know, it is interesting to the extent that, so to bring it back around to like the US ban, you know, as much as I have concerns about the approach of the DSA and the framing of the DSA itself and the way it's being implemented now and being used, at least this focus is investigating a particular action by TikTok and seeing like whether or not that violates the DSA, as opposed to the here in the US, where if we're going to continue the bull analogy, I guess we have the sort of bull in China shop approach of like, just break it all, you know. There's it's not like, let's investigate this particular aspect of what TikTok is doing that is problematic. Is it problematic on national security grounds? Is it problematic on privacy grounds? Is it problematic on propaganda grounds? Like, whatever, doesn't matter. Just you know, China's got to get rid of it or it has to be banned. And so it's not, in my opinion, certainly not the greatest approach. I think it's constitutionally problematic. We've talked about this before. I think there are a lot of problems with it, but it is now law. It got bundled. The way it became law was it got bundled with a bunch of foreign aid to Ukraine, to Israel, and to Taiwan, and a few other things. That's sort of the nature of the way U.S. Legislation gets
baffling
done.
To me, but
yeah, it's
apparently
baffling.
that's how it works.
It's baffling to me as well, and to lots of people, but it is the nature of the political process in the policymaking process in the U.S. that these things get bundled. It struck me as notable that in the signing statement that President Biden made in signing the bill, he didn't mention the TikTok ban at all. He talked a lot about the aid. He scolded Republicans a whole bunch and didn't mention the TikTok ban. And then later that day, his campaign posted 2 more videos to TikTok, which struck me as interesting. And the vast majority of the comments on both of those videos were TikTok users just yelling at him and basically saying like, yo, bro, you posted this to TikTok, the app you just banned. You know,
let me floss, man. I want to.
Yeah.
Is that the latest thing, flossing?
I think that's a generation back. You're a little behind.
Oh God.
But and so we're going to see sort of what happens there. Obviously, TikTok is going to challenge the ban. They've made it really clear that they're going to challenge the ban. There's been some discussion. There was a report in the Information that ByteDance was exploring who they could sell the app to. Could they sell it to a non-technology company, effectively a non-competitor? And could they keep the algorithm? So that was the whole thing. Like, could we sell everything but keep the algorithm? ByteDance vehemently denied that on the record to the information. And then other stories came out like minutes afterwards, effectively saying that ByteDance had no intention of selling and divesting and would absolutely prefer to shut down the app. So I think there's a little bit of a game of chicken going on. They're going to challenge it in court, and when they challenge it in court, they can probably delay the timeline. The timeline is effectively they have 9 months to sell it, but if they're showing in the 9 months that they've made some progress, they can get another 3 months. So really, they have a year, but they can probably stop that clock by going to court. And so I've actually been thinking that, I originally thought they would go to court immediately, and was kind of surprised there hasn't been a lawsuit. There might be, by the time we're done with this, but like there might be a lawsuit soon. But there might be an advantage to like waiting a month or two, just to like extend the clock out a little further. Because once they file the lawsuit, they can probably get the court to effectively stay the law and say this law is put on hold until we go through this analysis process, and therefore they may get more time if they wait a little bit. But we'll see how that goes. And I think there are some really big questions about what it means on both ends. Can the U.S. government ban an app or force divestiture of it, and what will that mean larger? To a larger scale.
What effect could or does the election in November have on this process? Does that change timings at all? I mean, Joe's gonna have to stop posting on TikTok at some point.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the campaign told NBC, we will go where the voters go. And it's like, okay, so you're sort of admitting that this is an important venue for speech, which probably works against you in any lawsuit around whether or not there's First Amendment issues here. I don't know how much the election will directly have an impact. I mean, there's no chance that the app is banned by the time of the election, based on the timing here and based on the lawsuit. There is, like, Donald Trump has sort of flip-flopped on this, where he was the originator of the idea of banning TikTok and tried it and failed. And then recently, after he met with one of the largest investors in TikTok, American investors in TikTok, he completely changed his mind. And now he's already talking about how Biden has cost himself the election by banning TikTok.
Yeah.
We'll see. It does feel like, I'm certainly not a politics expert, it feels like a weird sort of potential misstep. If you're trying to get out the youth vote and trying to get the youth engaged, to like ban the app that they like the most, that feels like a sort of dangerous thing. So it might lead to some backlash, but I don't know that it has any major direct impact on the election.
Okay. And before we move on to the other stories in today's episode, we should probably talk about Project Texas just very briefly.
Yeah,
which I think is an interesting addition to the discussion, right? So Project Texas being the quite extensive, very expensive plan to try and ensure that this ban didn't go ahead, which took place 18 months or so ago and involved the creation of a new organization which was going to house the data of the US version of TikTok, right?
Yeah.
Which was trying to kind of allay fears around Chinese government officials having access to US citizens' data. It tried to allay fears about the fact that the algorithm could be augmented to control US citizens' minds. And that whole plan kind of didn't get off the ground, right, before this process took place.
It did and it didn't. And actually, like, the Project Texas story goes back further, right? It really has its roots in the attempt by Trump to ban TikTok,
right,
and to force its sale in a much more clumsy way. And originally Microsoft and Walmart wanted to buy TikTok, and apparently Trump quashed that and said, no, basically, like, the sale has to go to someone who I'm friends with, more or less. I mean, it feels a little corrupt, but probably because it was kind of corrupt. And he really wanted Larry Ellison, who has been a Trump supporter and is the founder and not CEO, but chief technical officer of Oracle, to buy TikTok. But Oracle didn't want to spend whatever money and didn't want to own the sort of consumer app that's really not Oracle's business. So they worked out this weird convoluted thing where the data would all be hosted. It would go into Oracle's fledgling cloud operation. Everybody talks about Google and Microsoft and Amazon as cloud providers. Oracle's trying to be a cloud provider. They have some success. That Zoom is all based on Oracle Cloud. Okay. So they basically said, oh, this is a business deal. We can get TikTok's cloud hosting business, and then we can promise that we'll host everything in Texas, in the US. And on top of that, we'll add in this ability that we will audit all of their systems and make sure that the data is kept in the US and kept private and not being sent back to China. And so they've built some of that. And my understanding is that there was an announcement last year at some point that Oracle was now officially auditing TikTok's data and that a bunch of it was stored in the US. It just feels like everyone sort of forgot about it. And it's not entirely clear, like how much, how do you control for all that data? It's not entirely clear.
Could that plan be resurrected if the appeal is successful?
Yeah.
And like, is it possible, do you think that the Texas project could be allowed to kind of continue to its fruition?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding at least is that is still the intention, that TikTok is still sort of working towards that. And there are some difficulties in just kind of like the logistical aspects of it, but they've been building it and that Oracle's been working with them on it. So I don't think that has ever stopped. It just feels like policymakers kind of forgot about it.
If the divestiture doesn't happen in 9 months, the app will be banned and there'll be no more TikTok in the US.
This is sort of. I mean, even that is complex, right? And I know we don't have that much time, but it's sort of fun to get into the weeds a little bit on this, which is that it's just that the app stores have to not allow it. So it's just that Google and Apple can't allow it. In theory, then it begins to get complex. In theory, the website still works. The ability to sideload the app could still work. There are a couple other ways that it could work. You could do web-based apps on phones that could work. There are some ways of reading the law that might also force ISPs to try and block it, but it's probably not. And that would raise even more First Amendment issues, especially the same week that the U.S. has restored net neutrality laws, which we're not even going to touch. No. So it's really challenging. And I'm actually kind of curious to see how Google feels about all of this, because the companies that stand to benefit from TikTok being banned in the US are Instagram, absolutely, and YouTube as well. But I also feel like Google might not like the idea of the US government telling them that they have to ban an app from the Google Play Store. And so like Google has really competing interests, and I'm sort of curious to see how they feel about it. And I don't know if they've commented on it at all.
Yeah. Google would just love to have a social platform or app that was moderately used, probably first, before that they had it banned. I mean, that would be the starting point. No, but I take your point.
I mean, let's be clear. YouTube is one of the most used apps in the world, and everyone sort of forgets about it, that it is a social app that nobody considers, and yet has more usage than basically any other app out there, and more time.
I'm just sad about Google Plus not existing. That's all.
Yes.
But talking of app stores and the importance of app stores in allowing access to content and to apps, we're going to start there for the rest of our roundup, Mike, because you picked out a story about a topic we don't really talk about very often, AR and VR, and the fact that Meta are thinking about how they expand their influence in the space, which is going to have potential content moderation implications in the future.
Yeah, and in particular, they've opened up the Horizon OS, which is the operating system they use for their VR headsets, the Quest, so that others can make hardware on it. And so Lenovo and Asus and a few others, I think, are making VR hardware that will now use the Horizon OS. And so everything that anyone who owns a Quest has access to will have access to as well.
Are you a Quest user?
I am not. I mean, I have used Friends on occasion, but I don't have one, and I am not a regular user of it.
Me neither. Our producer Lee spoke quite authoritatively about it, and
yes,
so we are kind of going by what he says. But this has kind of quite big implications, right? Because app stores wield a lot of power, and the idea of Meta kind of having a role as an OS provider and being a layer in between hardware and users means that they could play a bigger role in AR and VR safety, right? Which is, we know, has been a big issue.
Well, I think the framing, and we talked about this earlier before we started the podcast as well, that sort of gives you a sense of what is happening here, is this idea that effectively before this, Meta's metaverse play was similar to Apple and iOS, where they own the operating system, they own the App Store, and they own the hardware, and they controlled everything top to bottom. And this is them switching from that integrated model to an Android model,
Mm,
where they produce some hardware, they still own the OS and the App Store, but they allow other hardware players to come in and provide. And in fact, they're sort of hoping that that might really boost the market and get a lot more people using it. But it opens up a bunch more questions of what happens. I think part of the reason they're doing this is that Meta made this huge bet on the metaverse. I mean, they changed their name to Meta, and they
yeah.
sort of acted like this was the biggest thing in the world. And they've sort of come back to reality a little bit, that this didn't take off in the way that they expected and hoped, and they spent billions of dollars on it and it hasn't been as successful. But they're realizing, maybe if we open it up, maybe if we let other people try and build stuff. I mean, there are obviously other VR and AR products on the market, but setting it up so that, okay, we're going to provide you with the OS. There's a whole bunch of apps. We have the App Store, so other people can just build hardware. Like, maybe somebody will figure out the magic
Mm,
system that makes this become the next big platform. And then Meta
mm,
is built in there, and Meta doesn't have to invent it in house entirely. It really is the same approach that Google took with Android,
yeah.
though Google started that way. And I think it would have been nicer if Meta had started there also. But then there just become questions where, if that becomes the standard and they own the App Store aspect of it, you have all the safety questions around reviewing apps and determining what is allowed. There are already safety questions around the VR space, around harassment and everything. And to its credit, Meta has taken that somewhat seriously in what they've done already in different apps, and they've talked about the safety in the VR space quite a bit. And obviously, they had hoped that VR would be a bigger thing for themselves. So maybe they have a bunch of trust and safety people sitting around waiting for more people to be using the system to deal with
Yeah.
trust and safety problems, and are hoping to do it. But like, there are questions about which apps are going to be allowed. There's sort of, as we understand it, there's a couple different aspects to the App Store. There's sort of like the heavily curated one, and then the more Wild West one. And they're sort of bringing those two things closer together. So there may be a few more questions about what apps are allowed in the metaverse and how that
Yeah.
works.
And to liken it to the Google Android Play again, you don't need a very large number of apps that cause harm or that slip
Yes.
through the cracks when you're operating at that scale for it to be an issue, right? And
Yes.
Meta has knows that from its social products.
Yeah.
But this is a whole new frontier for them. And so yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks for bringing that story to us. I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of, and also AI story, but one really interesting partnership that we've seen spring up this week, which is potentially a bit frothy, but I think is worth noting, is the fact that 10 of some of the largest generative AI companies in the world have come together to form a partnership to implement safety by design principles
Yes.
to try and mitigate some of the issues we talked about in the podcast. So this is all the names that you'll be familiar with. We've got OpenAI, we've got Anthropic, we've got Amazon, Meta, Google, all the folks who own the biggest, kind of most powerful large language models have basically come under one umbrella, coordinated by two nonprofits, All Tech is Human and Thorn, to basically commit to trying to prevent AI CSAM. Because as we know, as we talked about, once it happens, it's super hard to address. And so this is basically the end of a paper, a piece of research that a number of different people in those organizations have come together to create. And the paper's worth reading if you get a chance. It comes up with a series of principles that all of these companies are now going to adopt in their work, basically across the whole development of large language models. So the creation of them, the deployment of them, and the maintaining of them. And in theory, this is going to help create a standard for developing large language models, and a safety standard as well, which is something that is not really in the market right now. It doesn't really exist. So this is good. There's another part to it, which is that all of the companies have committed to being more transparent about their efforts,
Hmm.
although it doesn't necessarily specify what transparency means. It would be lovely to have some of these efforts made available so the likes of you and I can report about them and talk about them. I wonder how much that will be true. But yeah, it's a step in the right direction, and fair play to All Tech is Human and Thorn for kind of bringing these different companies together who you would hope would be talking about some of these shared challenges already. Sometimes it's not always possible. So
Yeah. I mean, I thought this was an important step. We'll see how impactful a step it is. I'm not
mm,
convinced it's going to be as impactful as people hope. The things that struck me, and this does go back to, we didn't even talk. There was a little bit of discussion in the Stanford paper about how AI generated CSAM really threatens to overwhelm the system that is already overwhelmed. Just
yeah,
the amount of content. I've spoken to a few trust and safety experts who have pointed out that there are lots of problems with AI generated CSAM, but one of them is, we talked about the difficulty of prioritizing things. The prioritizing becomes even more difficult when it's much harder to tell if it is a real child who is being abused or an AI generated one. And if you
yeah,
flood the system with AI generated CSAM, then the really scary part is it makes it that real children who are getting abused are sort of lost in the system. There will be such a flood that it will be difficult to pick out which ones are real and who need help. And so there's a real concern there. And the feeling not that long ago was that a lot of the AI companies did not much care about this. And so to
yeah,
see basically all of the big ones, all of the ones who are working on what's known as frontier models, the main models that everybody else uses, agreeing to try and put in safety aspects into their models, including, importantly, the open source models. That was the thing that was most concerning to me. I'm a big supporter of open source, and I think open source AI is really important. But there is a real fear that when you have an open source model, that is more prone to abuse because there's much less control over it. There is still questions of like, are people going to sort of strip these safety measures from the open source models? But hopefully there's enough that can be done to really protect and limit the ability of people to use these AI models to generate artificial CSAM.
yeah,
We'll see. The issue with AI is that there are always hacks around these things and prompt injection type things that get around all of the safeguards. Like, it happens over and over again. That's still going to be
mm,
a challenge, but at least they're thinking about it. At least they're working with Thorn and All Tech is Human to try and come up with something. And hopefully they'll be transparent about how well these things work and what they're finding and where it can be made.
yeah. I'd love to have somebody from this group of companies come on at some point on the podcast and talk about
Yeah.
their efforts. I think that'd be really interesting, and how they're working together, particularly. The next story you flagged, Mike, is not one of the big tech companies in this coalition, a very small community called Wattpad that
Yeah.
you talked about, and the new effort that it's made to reduce harm on its platform.
Yeah. So Wattpad has been around for a while. It's actually a really interesting platform, usually for like fan fiction. It's a community site where people write and share fan fiction. And they decided this week to shut down DMs. And there had been some complaints that in the past there were attempts to groom some users on Wattpad via the DMs. And
Hmm.
basically the platform determined like this is too much of a hassle. Not that many people actually use the DM functionality on Wattpad. And we're more of this sort of publishing community for public discussion, and private discussions are kind of a hassle too far. And therefore, we're just going to shut it down. And it's just interesting to see because for all of the different challenges that we see about online speech and online communications, seeing a service say, you know what, this is not core to our business. We're just going to shut it down. If people want to communicate, they're going to have to find a different way to do it. Our sort of mode of communication is public discussion. That solves this one aspect of the trust and safety challenge. Was interesting to see.
Mm.
Just sort of stood out to me as something you don't see every day.
And it links neatly into the fourth story that we will round this week's podcast up with, which is an interview with Jason Citron, who's Discord's founder,
Yeah.
which is obviously a very heavily used platform / app. And he talks to Nilay Patel on The Verge's Decoder podcast, really about this distinction that you're talking about here, right? Which is the kind of fork in the road that some platforms have between being a social platform that is public to most of its users and being a messaging platform.
Yep.
And Jason it's a really interesting discussion. Discord has had its challenges in the past around content moderation. It was recently the subject of a Netflix documentary about some leaks of US intelligence data. And so it hasn't got it all right, but it has grown its trust and safety function largely over the last few years. And he talked about how there are basically two modes really in terms of its platform and how it moderates. There is the kind of very private, semi-private servers and spaces that it needs to give people the tools to moderate content on, because it's kind of really up to them. And there is the messaging function, which it feels like it needs to moderate, and it has a way of doing that. It doesn't use end-to-end encryption because it feels like it can't fulfill its mission of keeping folks safe, gamers safe, often young gamers as well, safe with end-to-end encryption. And so it's really interesting just to kind of hear him talk about those two modes. And when we talk about the Wattpad story, you can see how they've really taken the decision in a route to go down there, which is really interesting. Have you ever come across an app, Mike, that's like killed DMs or like killed a feature as part of like quite a drastic attempt to reduce harm? I was wondering if there was like an equivalent of this before.
I mean, there have definitely been some. I'm sort of blanking on the spot of things. The first one that came to mind, and it's not the same in any sense at all. It's not killing a feature, but like just killing just a point of annoyance effectively was, of all things, the knitting community site Ravelry,
All right.
which a few years ago banned any discussion about Donald Trump. Just because they realized,
I think I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they just realized that was just such a trust and safety nightmare and headache that they just didn't want to deal with it. And they just said, look, you can have your political views, but like, this is not the place to be having that discussion because it always goes crazy. And so it's not quite the same thing, because that's not a feature that was banned. I mean, I'm sure that there are other apps. I'm blanking on the spot of like.
Yeah. I mean, in some respects, like it's the idea that all platforms should be everything is kind of contributes to the spread of trust and safety resources, of knowledge about the harms at play. It feels like Wattpad are basically saying, we want to be this kind of community. We know we can deal with these kind of harms. It doesn't benefit us greatly. I respect that in many ways, to kind of slim down what it offers to users, and as part of an effort to keep it safe.
And I also think like there's an interesting comparison there with the Citron interview in terms of like understanding what kinds of spaces you're creating, what kind of community are you creating, are they public spaces, are they private spaces, and what are the trade-offs for each of those? And there are benefits and values that that are beneficial and tricky with each of those things. And it's important for companies to recognize what it is that they really want to be, and figuring out the best way to handle those different challenges.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I mean, I guess actually that does bring up one other one, which we could have spoken about a couple of weeks ago, which was the Snapchat. Snapchat had that I forget what they called it now, because this just happened.
It was like a map, right? There was kind of some sort of map.
It was like this like universe of your friends, like who you were closer to and whatnot. And they ended up killing it, but that was basically because like they were getting a ton of criticism of the potential sort of social harm. But I don't. That was a few weeks ago, and I don't remember the details on that story right now.
Me neither. I'm gonna try and look it up now.
Yeah,
I think that's like a helpful point at which to kind of wrap up today's episode, Mike. I think we've really gone across the world in terms of our stories, gone from the US and TikTok and to Europe and to the efforts to kind of regulate that. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up today?
No, I think that's it for this week. Obviously, as we said, lots of news. There are a bunch of other stories we wanted to cover and we didn't, but we're already going pretty long. So there's a lot going on in the world of online speech right now.
Yeah. And thanks to all for listening. Thanks for tuning in. If you have time and energy, please do leave us a review and rate us on all the podcast channels that you listen to us. We'll be back next week, and hopefully we'll see you here as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. This podcast is produced with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund, a fiscally sponsored, multi-donor fund at global impact that supports charitable activities to build a more robust, capable, and inclusive trust and safety ecosystem.